in this episode with Angie Warren-Clark.
I do have to say, though, and I've thought long and hard about how I talk about this because, I love my family and I have the utmost respect for the work that my family has done to change, and particularly my dad. His kids got beaten, and I was one of those kids. So we didn't just get the occasional smack, we got beaten. And so for me, at about age 7, I remember this moment where I was like, I will never do that to my children. I will never be in that circumstance where I am doing that to my children. And there was a little moment then, I think, where I realised that this was wrong and I needed to fight against it with all my will and all my being. So yeah, that was kind of, so that was about 7, and damn it, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to be a family court lawyer, and I'm going to work in the field of family violence because that's what this woman has done, and she's my hero.
So, Angie, thank you for being here today. Appreciate you taking time out from your busy schedule to be interviewed. Before we get into the details of your life, work, and legacy, I thought maybe I could ask you just to kind of summarize what, your perspective, what you believe is your life's work. Oh, tricky question to start with.
Just a small question. Oh, well, thanks for having me, first of all. I think possibly my life's work is around the elimination of family and sexual violence. And basically that's probably because it's the work that gives me the most enjoyment and satisfaction and purpose. So I think that's possibly it. There are other aspects as well around the environment and things like that, but primarily my work is in that space.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. Well, as I say, we'll probably get into a bit more detail about that when we cover the work aspect, which is quite a big piece for everybody, right?
Sure.
We all have to work. But thinking about, and maybe there might be some correlation between what you just said and something that's maybe triggered that earlier in your life, I'm not sure. But can you give me some context around who Angie is, where you've come from, what your childhood was like? So if we go way back to Angie as a child, where did you grow up? What was life like?
Yep, sure.
Who were you as a character?
Okay. Politicians love to talk about themselves, so you may regret this. So I was born in Murupara, but predominantly grew up in Northland. My parents moved up in Northland with us. I think I was 4, and they were in the forestry industry, and so they moved up to Northland for that. And so I grew up in some very small communities, Mangamuka, Horeki, a place called Utukura, and a little place called Okaiho, which is where I did most of my growing up. Pretty rural community, probably about, 25 minutes from Kirikiri or Kaikoui, kind of very close to beaches. A lot of farm and forestry was really what we did as a family. And so, small community but pretty close-knit. lots of good things about the rural community that I grew up in. But also, I was born in 71. So in 1971, and in the 70s when I was growing, as a young, very little person, being a child in that time was kind of difficult, or more difficult than I guess it is today. And that one of the things that happened is kids got beaten. And I was one of those kids. So we didn't just get the occasional smack, we got beaten. And so for me, at about age 7, I remember this moment where I was like, I will never do that to my children. I will never be in that circumstance where I am doing that to my children. And there was a little moment then, I think, where I realised that this was wrong and I needed to fight against it with all my will and all my being. So yeah, that was kind of so that was about 7, and don't get me wrong, I had tremendous opportunity in my household, in my family. I had all sorts of good things happen, but we also had family violence, and so that shaped the person I am today very much, I think. And I guess really gave me the determination to never see that happen to another child or another family. And part of that is realising that actually in order to move from being a victim to a survivor of violence, you really have to do some serious work, and you need to kind of manage to do things in a way that actually supports you growing and changing. And so that's why I say a lot of my life's work has been around the family violence space. Yeah. I do have to say though, and I've thought long and hard about how I talk about this because, I love my family and I have the utmost respect for the work that my family has done to change, and particularly my dad. He was a man of his time, an incredibly hard worker. Like the man he'd be up at 5:30 in the morning and he would be still running his business at 10:30 at night. He went all day, every day, 7 days a week, ran a really successful forestry industry business, but a man of his time. In his views, what he'd learned as a child was that you could hurt the people you loved in order to control them. And that is something that he's learned is not right now. And people judge so much. They judge around, oh, how could you ever do that to your children? Or how could you ever do that to your wife? But actually, it's part of our culture. And we all need to stop with the judgy pants and get on with a change. And that's one thing I'm tremendously proud about my dad, is that he has learned another way. And that's really important. So I don't want this conversation to be about how terrible he was. It's more about the transformation that I've seen in my own family and also the transformation that I believe should happen in this country. And so that's, I guess, that's part of it. But I guess the other part is I had a normal upbringing as a kid. We rode our bikes and cruised around, and back then, you had to be home before dark. That was pretty much it. No cell phones. I had a Rally 20 push bike, no gears. We just had a great time as country kids. Eeling and doing stuff, and I guess the other part was my incredibly privileged childhood with my best friend and her family, fishing and doing all things to do with the sea as well. So I've fishing, diving, sailing, surfing, great childhood.
Adventurous childhood.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Angie, thank you for sharing what you just shared about your time as a young person and that family violence. And in particular, I think immediately you've raised something for me that is an insight. I think ordinarily, and having been someone who's worked in the police many years ago and dealt with family violence and violence of all kinds, domestic abuse, it's interesting to hear you say, and what you said about not having your judgy pants on, I think was the term you used, and seeing your father the way he was, which is a man of his time, and that those circumstances, and maybe we could delve into that a little bit more, maybe uncover that. I think there's something in that. That this wasn't necessarily just about your father and his particular traits; it was circumstance and the environment in which he'd grown up in. We don't often hear that.
Yeah.
We don't often pay too much attention to that. And I think it's important to do that in understanding why domestic violence happens. Because if we don't really understand the problem, how can we work out how to fix it?
Yeah.
It ends up being quite sort of surface level and dealing with symptoms as opposed to dealing with the proper root cause. So are you able to maybe expand on what your thoughts are? Maybe, you've had conversations with your father and with your parents and other family members about why it was like that at that time.
Yeah, I think, well, generally, if I can sort of expand it out a bit, so beliefs and values in this country around the role of women and children and men, it is a huge area that we need to sort of unpack. You've probably heard the term toxic masculinity, that belief that you have to be constantly in charge and in control and making sure that everyone does what you need them to do. Ultimately, it's a very empty existence. And I know certainly for my dad, he grew up in a west coast of the South Island, as did my mum. And his parents, he was one of those children that was born many years after his three siblings. So he was born late in life for his mum. And they were very, very hardworking people, but they were also they spent a majority of their time. Their role was to basically run pubs, so they were publicans. So it was quite a tough, west coast to the South Island, pretty tough environment. A lot of drinking, a lot of kind of. I guess really quite addictive behaviours and abusive behaviours. Don't get me wrong, my nana and granddad really salt of the earth, but literally a really tough environment to bring a kid up in. And I think he was pretty much dragged up a lot of the time. And that's, how do you learn to be a good parent when your parents are absent? And I think that's one of the things that I've come to realise, that despite my dad not having a constant in his life to help raise him, he did his very best for us, and he was certainly a constant in our lives. He was always there for us. And so you see that kind of shift of generations, because I know that one of the things that he always said to us was, it doesn't matter what you do as long as if you need help, you let us know and we'll be there. And that to me was, tremendous comfort, particularly when you're making terrible mistakes as a teenager or whatever, a tremendous comfort to know that there's, someone there or parents there to always, they won't necessarily agree with you, but they're there. And so, part of that culture, heavy drinking, absent parent, raising yourself, getting yourself off to school if you felt like it, all of those kinds of things were the sorts of things that my dad grew up with. So, it's quite hard to say this, and I hope he doesn't feel too badly about this, but, I think he had a very neglected childhood. He didn't have the opportunity to probably even connect and engage and feel loved and supported. So that was part of it. Nevertheless, you make a choice. You make a choice whether or not you continue that legacy. Mm. And so at a certain point in his life, he made the choice not to. But before that, it was survival, I think.
It's interesting what you say there, is that because it's we are creatures of our environment. We become like I think I can't remember whose quote this is now, but we become like the people we hang around with, the 5 closest people we hang around with.
Yeah, sure.
So if you're in an environment like your father was, and we can look back now with the benefit of hindsight and say that it was neglect, but he probably didn't. I don't know. I'm putting words in your mouth or his mouth, but I just know that in the time we might not feel that, but when we look back, we can see it differently. Absolutely. Maybe with a different perspective.
Yep.
But at the time we're growing up with that, it's normal, or feels normal, because we don't know any different.
Yep.
And so to your point about making a choice, and I want to come back to you making that choice at 7 years of age or however old it was that you did. But we make a conscious choice sometimes. I think most of our choices are unconscious because we tend to just be going with the normalization and the flow of things. And it's not until something triggers us to stop and think, hang on a minute, that we then start to have a conscious thought process that then we can make a decision.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
I agree.
So for you, what was, as a young person, that's 7-ish years old, what was it that made you think that you were going to break that circuit, if you like, or that pattern of that type of behavior being normalized within your family?
I think it's, for me, it was a clarifying moment where, kids see things black and white, justice, injustice, good, bad. And I think for me it was a particularly unfair thing that happened. And I've just realised that no, actually I wasn't to blame for that. That wasn't an appropriate response. That because I think I'd done something like I had back then, gosh, sounds so old, back then, if poppies, and the poppies weren't the flat ones like we have now, they were literally a cupped poppy, and it was sort of made with sort of some kind of wire or something, and they were held together, and I unpicked it, pulled it to pieces, and I remember getting beaten for that because I was disrespecting the Anzacs. I was like, in my head, I suddenly realised, actually, that was a disproportionate response to something that had happened, and it was there, right then it was like, actually, this is completely unfair. I didn't realise that my actions would be taken in that way, and I could have been explained to that, actually, that's the perspective that Dad had, but no, instead I was punished for and it was completely out of proportion. So I just remember thinking to myself that I would never treat my children like this. Now, I know that many children think that, and I know that, as children we learn how to essentially live with these things. And so I think what happened essentially then was that my trick had to be to continue to believe that. And that was the hardest part of it, because you need to continue to believe that actually you're not at fault, you're not to blame. It is not about you. And at 7, that may be a bit clearer. When you're 14 and you're doing bad stuff, getting in trouble, it's maybe easier to blame yourself for the consequences of that. And then as a young woman, learning to break those cycles of behaviour is really important as well. So, you actually see what you model what you see around you. So who do you choose to be like? Do you choose to be like the victim? Do you choose to be like the perpetrator? Which choice do you go? And in fact, what you really need to do is go down the third track, which is just actually, it's not about violence. It's about living in respectful relationships. So it's about learning how to do something differently from what you've always known, which is an interesting little space to be in, I guess.
Yeah, it is. I'm keen, if you're happy to explore a little bit further. You clearly remember that particular incident with the poppy.
Yep.
How did you feel at that time? How did that make you, you said a response, so I want to come back to that, because I think there's a difference between response and reaction. But before we do that.
I was outraged.
Yeah, so talk to me more about that.
How did you feel? I was outraged that the pure and utter unfairness of that outraged me. I was literally, it was not fair. And as a consequence, it was kind of like, I'll never do this. But I remember it was almost like I swore an oath to myself or something, because the moment became very crystallised and clear for me, and I've never forgotten it. Maybe it was adrenaline, I don't know, but certainly it was, and that is probably also the time I was determined that I would never accept being beaten, that I would always fight back. So that was part of it as well.
It's quite a definitive moment in your life, really.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And, and I think as well, people think, gosh, you must have been, this or that, or, a poor family or whatever. But, I was a really privileged kid. We had whatever we wanted and needed. So it was actually not about being in poverty. It was not about being any of those things. It was actually about the use of violence and control. Plain and simple. And you have to be able to see beyond some of those myths and stereotypes as well, I think. Because, I'm a Pākehā woman. Part of being at that time, you didn't talk about family violence. It was very hard. I had no one to talk to. It was very hard to be able to be believed if I was to say anything, because I didn't look like the victim. I wasn't all of those things that we learn in our myths as well. So I thought that I was on my own to fight this. Yeah.
And how did that feel?
I'm quite a practical person. I was just get on with it, because, you can, like I say, you can choose to be a victim. You can choose to be a survivor. I wasn't going down without a fight.
Yeah. You talked about, there's lots in here, actually. I just hope that I remember to come back to some of it, because I think some of it is what you're just referring to there. Maybe we'll come back to that when we talk about your work now, or actually also in the past, but about how big a problem is this really, and understanding that, because something you said there reminded me of a comment that the previous guest said about alcoholism in families, that it's more, you're more aware of it in the working classes, if you like, if that's the right sort of term, because you can see people drinking down at the club, and it's in your face. But in the sort of middle classes, for instance, it's the drinking's happening at home,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe that's the same for violence, because the two are connected.
Yeah.
I've no doubt about that. Just again based on my work history. So what we don't see, we don't know about, and therefore that's what shapes our thinking about what family violence is and where it sits within society.
So it's a really complex, if it was simple, it would be solved, right? It's a really complex set of circumstances. So family violence isn't caused by alcoholism. It's exacerbated by alcoholism. But you'll have many, many people who are victims of violence or living lives of quiet desperation where alcohol isn't a factor and violence is still present. It's easier when you're being disorderly in public to see violence. It's easier when there's a big party on and, someone is violent for the police to be called, those kinds of things. So that is the case, that it always looks like violence and alcohol. I mean, certainly at Refuge we experienced, there was always an uptick rugby season and violence, always an uptick, particularly if the All Blacks lost. You would know it well yourself as having been a police officer. It's one of those things that happens. But alcoholism, it's like this. If you are going to be violent, if you're a nasty drunk, if you're a violent drunk, then you don't drink. That's the choice you make. You just don't drink. And so that's the difference. If people consider that it's okay when they drink, that what does that ad say? Their other mates come out. People think that that's okay. Then actually they are part of and perpetuating abuse and blaming the alcohol, when really they're a violent person who was also violent when they're drunk.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Can I go back, Angie, to your father? And I think, again, I'm very cautious and careful not to be judgmental, but there's opportunities to learn from here. And it sounds like your family's learned, you've learned, your family's learned from it. So hopefully you can share some of that learning as well. In respect of your father, his reaction, you call it response. For me, what you said around explaining why it was disrespectful to pick apart a poppy, that would be a response. A reaction is a little bit more chemical reaction. Less thinking goes into it. It's an automatic response. And we kind of, and if you've got a violent kind of propensity, then you'll lash out. Yeah. So that reaction, have you talked about that particular incident with your father as an example of why he would react that way and what was going on for your dad?
I don't think I have. Not that particular one. I have talked about other instances. I do refute that he's out of control in those sort of circumstances. He wasn't. You make a choice, and I know I keep saying this, but literally you yourself would have experienced a time where you're like, man, I'm just gonna, and then you've gone, took a breath or whatever it is, and just talked yourself down. And that's the skill that I think a lot of men in particular need to have, because it's not okay to just do that stuff. And so I think, I think it is really, it's about, you see, the reason you might have stopped using violence or done something impulsive is because you thought of the consequences of doing that. The beliefs and values of the violent man are that they have a right to, because that is how they control their family or their workmates or whoever. That's what they do. And so, it's those beliefs and values that actually literally say, it's okay to do this because I'm in charge. This is I need to keep control of this person, and I will hurt them because I've lost control of how they're doing something or thinking or whatever. So really simply for me, family violence is sort of, it's broader than just a physical attack as well. So it's stopping someone from doing something, making them do something, or punishing them. So it's 3 parts to that. So it can be, financial abuse as well as it could be, psychological abuse. And I think that's all part of it as well. The thought process, which is the difficult part, is actually I have a right to do this because they're my children, or that's my wife, or those are my employees, or that's my, those are the people. I should be able to control them, and I will, because I don't like what they're doing. So, yeah.
Do you think in that moment, though, when there's a reaction happens, that there is actually a thought process that we can measure? Like and I'm thinking about the sort of, if it's a pattern, it's behavior, it's a belief, it's in there, then you are literally reacting to an outside stimulus, which is, say, for instance, Angie picking a poppy apart and being disrespectful.
Yeah.
That's why I kind of make the, or place the emphasis on reaction rather than a response. For me, when I teach about leadership and things like that in my other role, I talk about, reaction is more automatic response. It's inbuilt there. It's ingrained there. It's based on experiences, it's knowledge, it's beliefs, it's values.
Yeah.
And so therefore it just happens. I've done it before and we just react, as opposed to what you're describing. And you described it as a skill set, and I completely agree with that. It's a skill to be able to stop, pause, create a space between that stimulus and response, and think about the stimulus. Think about that child picking apart a poppy. Yeah. Is she aware that that's disrespectful? And then making those considered choices. Yep. That's how I see it. And maybe I'm wrong, and I'm happy for you to tell me that I am. But I kind of see a difference between the two, and I just wonder, how do we get people who've got a propensity for violence as part of their normal kind of mode of operating, their modus operandi? How do we kind of change and provide that skill set so that they can provide a space between stimulus and response, and then think differently and thus act differently?
So there has been a huge body of work about changing perpetrator behaviour. It's a huge body of work, and essentially it's about, first of all, accepting that the response is not appropriate. So actually acknowledging. So we say there's the system, it's called minimising, denying and blaming. Oh, I just did that because, it was disrespectful. I did it because she pulled that poppy apart. It's disrespectful. So it's the minimising, denying and blaming keeps a person from actually accepting that their response isn't appropriate. And, that's a very simple example of, a proportionate response would have been, put that down, what's going on, not being punched in the face. So, that's the difference. And I think that's quite clearly, when you talk about how people are respond to these things. Somewhere in the thought process, it was appropriate to do that, and why. And that's the trick of our men in this country learning not to behave in that way. That's
So what's going to change, Angie, before they start to learn? So as an example, this is not about me, but I'm kind of currently relating this to all sorts of different things, which is interesting for me. So. And, the purpose of this podcast is for me to learn. I'll be honest with you. So I'm enjoying this. It's good. So, It's very hard. I do quite a bit of coaching, but it's very hard to coach someone who doesn't want to be coached.
Yes.
So how does a man who doesn't think that violence is wrong learn to behave differently?
You know, and again, there's a lot of work done around this. And one of the places, so you look at empathy and where children and babies learn empathy. So that first 1,000 days is so important. And again, I go back to my dad. You know, he was brought up in a space that he probably didn't have that from his mum and dad. He probably only had it from his siblings, and they did their best. So it's about, first of all, trying to stop the cycle, so not actually being in that space in the first place. But often men who are incredibly violent, they will go back, like I have, into a time where they knew that it was wrong as a child when it was happening to them, and how they swore that they would never do that to their families, or they were afraid, so it's connecting them back to the child and wanting them to, and them wanting to then never go back there again. We paint this picture that violent men are horrible, 100% horrible. They're not. They're just men who need help to change. And I'm purposely saying men, you'll note, because as a feminist woman, this is a gendered issue. So I'm purposely talking, and I don't want to talk about the women who are violent. And don't get me wrong, there are some. But it's actually a gendered issue. About 90% of all violence occurs by men to women or children. So that's where I'm kind of focusing.
Yeah.
So men choose to change for many reasons, and the trick is to find the motivator. The trick is to find the thing that motivates that person to want to change. Part of it can be, and for some men it can be like, I'm going to lose the status of my job, or if I don't change, and they've had other good men or family members say to them, if you continue to do this, we will go to the police and you will be charged, and we will support your wife or partner in that process, and you need to change. And that's enough. But others, it's right through to, having a consequence that is so, the weight of that consequence is so high that they must change. So it really depends on what motivates that individual. Now, someone who has been brought up in a situation where they have no empathy and can't connect is so much more difficult than someone who has and just chooses because it's a power thing. So, one of the things that I've done for many years is the provision of family violence programs to help support change. And that's, that's a motivation in itself. So some get sent and others will go because they have to. Their family has said, you have to go, you have to change, or this relationship is over. And others are just like, I am just being nasty and I need some skills. So, yeah, there isn't a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately, in this. I wish there was, because, that would be the end of family violence.
Sure.
But, yeah, certainly for a lot of men, it's like the consequences of not changing are bigger than are worse than the consequences of staying the same. Literally motivated because they'll be better off by changing.
So can I ask you, Angie, from a personal perspective then, what changed? What was you talked about motivation and incentive to change. What changed in your family, or changed for your father, and when?
I think part of it was he grew up, like, I've got to say, young men, full of vim and vigour. He kind of grew up, lost some of that kind of the hormonal kind of surges that were probably racing through his brain. And also he was a young dad, right? So, his brain wasn't developed till, 25, 26. So there was that part of it. But the other part was literally life life started to get in the way. So, my parents separated, and he began to realise that the world that he'd created, he needed to do some work to make sure that he kept his family.
So again, I'm sorry if I'm prying too much here, but so was that a consequence of the violence in the family?
No.
What was it? Something separate that caused that separation?
Yeah, something separate.
Right.
So they had met very young. Their first child, mum was 18, dad was 19. And time just kind of, they separated as it was basically in their early 40s, I think. Yeah.
So if we can, we've delved into your work quite a bit, or certainly your perspective on the things that you're working on. But if I can, I'll just nip back a little bit in time, and then we'll come back to that.
Sure.
So as you're growing up, you're a teenager, you're at school. What's kind of driving and motivating you then? What did you want to be when you grew up? I'm asking that question knowing that I still don't know yet. I'm working it out.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so very weirdly, I loved school and I thrived in the school environment. So I had, a secret life where I was being, beaten and hurt, but I was a super achiever at school. I loved school. I got lots of positives out of school. And I wanted to be a professor of fine literature because books were my escape. We had a house full of books everywhere, and I could escape into books. And that's what I wanted to be. So, I was at school and I was a sporty kid as well as an academic kid, and I was fairly popular, and I had, a good group of friends. But I wanted to go off to university, and I wanted to be a professor of fine literature. And so that was my thing that I wanted to do. Didn't happen. Completely didn't happen. But I was really passionate because there was something about the escapism, I think, of books and literature and the written word that I just loved.
What kind of literature was it? When you say escapism, are you disappearing off into other stories and to get away? Is that
anything?
Okay.
Anything and everything. One of the things that we, like I said, I had a pretty privileged childhood. We just had, books, anything and whatever we wanted. In terms of, and my dad was a reader, and we would, we have books all over the house, and we had, back in the day, you'd have those book clubs you'd belong to, and you'd get all of these cool books sent in and things like that. So we had that happening all the time. And so there wasn't a topic I wasn't interested in. I had a really curious mind, and I was kind of just ate that stuff up. Yeah, just loved it.
Yeah. So you didn't pursue that. What did you pursue?
Well, I had So I went from a small rural school. Back then it was called 1 to 7. It was first form to seventh form, and I was the head girl, and I was on the board of trustees as a student rep, and I was, did all of this cool stuff, and then I went off to university and I recreated myself. It was great fun because I think you get that opportunity when you go from a small town into this little community into this bigger community. So I recreated myself. I was at a place called Student Village, Waikato University. And I'd always had sort of, spiral perms and blonde hair and stuff. And I ended up getting myself some dreadlocks and, just kind of immersed myself in student politics. And I decided that I would do a number of papers in my first year just to see what I wanted to, what I really wanted to do, because I thought I did. So I had a couple of literature papers, some psychology papers, and I had some Te Reo Māori papers, and then I did some women's studies, which is now called gender studies, a couple of women's studies papers. And there was just this connection with the women's studies stuff. So I was in a lecture with the most amazing lecturer, guest lecture. We had a lecture called Women in Law, and Ruth Bush, who is a trailblazing family lawyer in our country, came and did a guest lectureship. And again, in that moment, there was something just came over me, and I was like, damn it, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to be a family court lawyer, and I'm going to work in the field of family violence, because that's what this woman has done, and she's my hero. So that's what I decided to do, like that. Just whole course of life changed like that. But if you think about it, really it was almost a natural conclusion to get there. So I applied in 1991, I applied, 1990, for the 1991 year, I applied to go into law school at Waikato University. It was the first year that we had direct entry into the law school, and we had the most amazing lecturers, and it was. I got accepted because I had great grades, and decided to do law. But then, because I'm a Gemini, I decided that I'd also do another degree as well at the same time. So I decided to do a degree in women's studies and New Zealand studies. So that's the sort of New Zealand studies are the study that you do about the history of this country without enough te reo Māori to do a BA in Māori. So that's sort of it in the women's studies. So I was basically like, law's my bread and butter. This social science degree is my super passion. Yeah.
What drove the interest in women's studies? What was that?
Again, it's that social justice stuff. So, part of it was around not being, when you see injustice and you grow up with injustice, you can accept it or you can fight it, right? And so that's what women's studies was about for me. It was actually trying to make, understand what my world was like. Yeah, trying to understand, because, the 90s, we had, there was a lot of stuff going on around the women's movement at that time, and we had fun. We had so much fun, just railing against the patriarchy and doing student stuff, like actually the really important stuff about raising your voice up and complaining about the state of women. And part of that was around how women were treated in the law, and how, how family violence was treated. And so back then we had, this incredible study done, and part of Ruth Bush was one of the lecturers who did that study around basically the state of family violence in this country, or domestic violence as we called it then, and the horror stories that happened around police response, around community response, around, just the way that people, women and children were being killed, and how we just continue to sort of not really make any changes. The women's Refuge movement was really strong. And it was just that kind of, that time. It was a really specific time. Culminated in the Domestic Violence Act in 1995. So I was right in the forefront of all of that. The law school where the research had occurred. It was just, it was a fascinating time.
Why do you think we were witnessing that kind of thing but weren't doing anything different?
Well,
as a society, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, part of it was around there was the belief back then that it was a private matter, right? So I don't know if you recall doing this as a police officer, but it was pretty common. You pick the guy, he'd done, he'd been violent, you pick him up, you take him around the block for a couple of times to have him cool off, and then he'd go home again. And it was just like, mate, you can't do that, but sort of no criminal offending, generally speaking, was ever kind of recorded. There wasn't really the consequence because it was seen as a private matter, a matter behind closed doors, and a man's home was his castle, and he had the right to do that. And that's where I talk about those changes of beliefs and values. We don't agree to that now. We don't think that that's the case now. But back then, very much so. I mean, I think, we just have to think about the fact that marital rape wasn't a crime till 1985 in this country. Those are the kinds of things that we just lived with. And, it's really interesting as an MP, I want to go back and read the Hansard, the record of those MPs that stood up and said that you had a right to rape in marriage. I'm really interested in seeing who, I haven't quite got around to it, but I'm really interested in seeing what their thought process was like back then, that women within a marriage had no right to say no, that they were a chattel and owned, it was, it was a different time, right?
That's a tricky thing though, isn't it? It's like now you and I are having a conversation about it. It seems completely
bizarre.
Off the charts. Yeah, exactly. But you're right. In order to actually, you can look back at records.
Yeah.
But we kind of have to put ourselves in their position with their information at their time.
Yeah.
To try and understand why that seemed like a rational thing.
Which is,
Yeah,
exactly like family violence, right? Back then it was kind of like, well, it's a private matter between the family and, we're not happy about it happening. But we know that family, it happens in that family or that family. Different time, So, a really exciting time at university to do that stuff.
Again, rubbing a bit of my story into this, but something you said, that was a question you asked me about, my experience in the police, and it's probably a little bit different actually, but I was in the UK in the police, and that was in the 90s, early 90s. And so I was a 20-year-old police officer going out and dealing with domestic disputes between people who were twice my age and then some.
Yeah, sure.
Wondering how the hell am I supposed to resolve this, But what I really struggled with at that time, and I didn't intend for it to go this way, but like we said, it's just going to go where it goes, right?
Sure.
And it's a question that I've thought about a lot since. But what I really struggled with at that time was you were right earlier, primarily the man, out of the situation. We would at least take them away and to the police station overnight.
Yep.
Because I think through experience we learned that if you went around the block a couple of times and dropped them back off again, you'd be there again an hour later.
Yeah, sure.
And it'd just escalate.
Yeah.
So you'd take one of them, usually the man, out of the situation.
Yeah.
And then in order to be able to progress anything, you'd need to be able to take a statement and then sort of invoke some kind of proceedings through the usual channels.
Yep.
What I struggled with as a young person to understand was why most of those statements, and I don't know whether possibly through fear, a lot of those statements were kind of revoked or rescinded. And,
yeah, absolutely.
You wouldn't end up getting to be able to go through the court process and dealing with that in a way that I'm saying maybe because punitive action doesn't always resolve things. But you didn't even get the chance to actually put that through the process.
Yeah.
And so the couple would be back in situ at home in that relationship again. And sure enough, within months you'd be back there doing the same thing. And it just seemed to be a pattern. And I really struggled with that as a young police officer to understand, why does this keep happening? Or why does that person want to subject themselves to that level of violence repeatedly? And I think maybe, can't speak for everyone, but maybe from the outside looking in, if that's not your experience, you've not got any understanding of it, we kind of view it, I'm going to say objectively.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not, but you kind of view it from a distance and form an opinion about the people involved.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is not necessarily the right opinion, of course.
And that's that kind of, and I think you're very delicately stepping around it. It's like, well, gosh, if she did, why doesn't she leave? Because it's so horrible, right? Which is the question that everyone gets asked. If it's so very horrible, this is awful, why don't you leave? Well, because it's complex, right? So I'll just respond to the police training first, and then I'll go back to that. So one of the things that we do in New Zealand now is we have some really significant training for our police force. They're dealing with more than 50% of their work now is family violence. So they have some significant training to try and help support them and understand their beliefs and values and understand that. And another part of what they do now is they have the ability to take a recording of the victim at the time of the incident. And that victim, she does not have to go to court and give her story again. She does it the once. She doesn't have to prove or stand up in court. And that is been so much more effective in terms of prosecutions and supporting people. So that's part of it, because the second part of this is that regardless of the violence, there is still often incredible love between these people. So you can be violent and still love someone. You can be a victim and still love the perpetrator, because they're not always that person. They're not always that violent person. They might be, as time goes on, more controlling and more violent. But there is, people just aren't a monster. They're not just a monster, a violent person. They're a whole pile of different things. So part of what happens for victims of violence is that it is incredibly hard to leave when you've got children, mortgage, a whole pile of different, you've got all sorts of things. When he is begging you and promising never to do that again, that he is sorry, that he will get help, that he will change, that he was wrong, that he loves you, So it's not just the sitting in this sort of isolated context. They've also got this whole kind of pressure. And the family could be pressurising as well. Like, we don't leave our men, or the church says you stay with your husband, or, but he's such a good guy. I've never seen him do that to you. What do you do to provoke him?
So that's an interesting thing. What do you do to provoke him?
Yeah, what do you do? What's your role in this? Because, you can be, bleep, bleep, bleep. Yeah. And I've seen you go off at him, and it's a wonder that he hasn't hit you sooner, which is, again, all those beliefs and values about she's responsible for this violence. So I think part of that real difficulty around people understanding is that they think of violence in a context of that one-off event, when actually it's about psychological abuse. You will never have someone who loves you like me. I will kill the children if you leave me. I will kill myself if you leave me. I will hunt you down, and I will tell your workplace what a crazy cow you are. I will do, I will put those photos of us on the internet. I will, so there's all of those kinds of uses of violence which sort of sit around and simmer around the physical violence. And many people are never hit. They're never hit in their lives. They might have had their favourite things smashed, or the walls might have holes in, but they've never physically been hurt, and they don't believe or understand that they've experienced violence either. So they're like, I know I feel miserable. I know that this is awful. I have to beg him for money. he won't let me see my friends. He smashes my phone, but he's never hurt me. And that's the difference. So, as a young police officer, and the other thing that police officers also used to talk to me about a lot, and I've worked with a lot of police over the years, is she would turn on them, on the police. So the victim would turn on the police and be swearing and effing and blinding and aggressively pushing them away and not seeking help. But that is a protective mechanism to keep her safe, because if she's seen to be talking, the police leave. They leave. But he's there.
I've experienced that.
Yeah. It's really awful. And it's like, but I'm just trying to help you. But literally, if she doesn't behave in that way, she's going to be punished even more when you're gone. So really complex, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So hard to kind of combat, because what we think of victims is that they are cowering in the corner, when often they're aggressively coming at you because they have to.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you for that. I was also reminded of a case where I got to speak to this individual because I did really genuinely sort of struggle with why she kept going back to this person who was, really violent.
Yeah.
I'm talking broken bones and cheekbones, and just couldn't really understand, why. And it was because she'd been made to feel that she was worthless, had no value, and that actually no one would appreciate her, and she was lucky to have him.
Yeah.
And when that was put to me, I kind of, that deepened my understanding a little bit.
Yeah. That psychological abuse is a massive part, and isolation as well. So psychological abuse, no one will ever love you, look at you, you fat cow, whatever, versus you take away all the person's support, their family, their friendships. They have no one but you, and you become their one source of truth, and that is an incredibly dangerous space to be in. Yeah, so part of the Domestic Violence Act, as it was in 1995, had psychological abuse as part of the definition of violence, which was incredible, because up until that point it had only ever been a physical act. Yeah, so it was a good broadening. But people still don't understand that now, even now.
So I'm conscious of the fact that I think we're jumping all over the place.
We are, yeah.
But I think for me it makes sense because we're talking about this, your life's work.
Yeah.
Which is good, and we're threading it through. So we'll keep going as we are, I think, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, sure. We kind of got deep very quick, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. But I think where I want to go to next, and again, it's sort of jumping back a little bit to come forward.
Sure.
You didn't go through with becoming a lawyer. You studied law,
yes.
am I right?
Yes.
But you didn't actually end up practicing
Right,
law.
yes.
So can you talk to us a little bit more about the choices back then around that and the direction and where to next?
So I guess quite an important aspect was I had a partner and we chose to have a child, and then I realised he's a good friend of mine now, but back then we weren't good for each other. Wasn't a good relationship. And so we separated, and I became a single mum as a student. And so that was quite, that was quite hard work. I was a student rep on the student union as a women's rights officer. I went back to work after 2 weeks with my child. It's only 12 hours a week kind of job, but I was a student as well. And so I spent a longer time at university, the equivalent of 7 years at university, got 2 degrees, one a 4-year degree, one a 3-year degree, but did that part-time. And part of that was I was always intending to be a family law practitioner. I did want to do that, but it actually became quite difficult as a single mum to get the opportunities to do that. So you'd have an internship over Christmas holidays, for example. Well, I wasn't able to do that. I didn't have the connections with law firms or, family connections or anything to get an internship, and there wasn't sort of any kind of idea that a single parent would have any kind of break and be, and have an opportunity. It was basically, can you do it? Shivers, I can't. Right, well, you're not given that opportunity then. So I didn't get to have some of those kind of experiences in law firms that many of us at that time did. And I kind of got to the end of that, my degree, and I thought I better find a job that actually can support me as a single parent. So I went into working in government roles. But then part of me did want to kind of go, actually, I do want to be a lawyer. So I went back and did my profs and became a barrister and solicitor, just to prove to myself that I could if I wanted to. Like I had the ability to do it, rather than technically wasn't able to put in the 60 plus hours a week and be in a culture which was quite toxic at the time, toxic culture, but also not at all welcoming to a single parent at the time.
Right.
Yeah. So I went into places that had good unionised employment that helped and supported parents, sick leave, annual leave, a salary and, a 40-hour week. So it was just practicality, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So at risk of going off on like another tangent, well, it's not a tangent as such, but that scenario that you just painted there. So you're a young woman with a child. Talked about a toxic environment, but just the ability to be able to work what the expectation is of a 60-hour week.
Yep.
Is problematic.
Yep.
For women to become lawyers.
Yep. Well, at that time, 50% of all graduates were women and 1% were partners. So, 1% of all women were partners. And that, so what does that tell you about equity in the law for women? I think it's probably significantly shifted now, but we have seen some interesting information about the toxic nature of some of our bigger law firms, for example. But, there wasn't, I'd gone through university and knew it for exactly what it was, but I still had a child to take care of, and I had to make the choice that I made. And actually, when I went into those jobs, they were better paid than new graduate lawyers were paid, because basically you got paid really poorly for the joy of all the, you basically put some money in the bank for that firm so that they would take you on longer term.
How did you feel if that was your passion, and obviously as a young woman, as a student, I've forgotten the lecturer's name now, Bush.
Yeah.
It inspired you.
Yeah.
And you could see a pathway for yourself, but you couldn't take it. How did that feel?
Look, I think I've said to you, I'm pretty practical. It was kind of like, will I be able to still continue to do my life's work while working in government organisations? And I could. So every time I worked in, work and income, I worked in ACC, and then in in Justice, in Ministry of Justice, every time I worked in that role, I would pivot my work to focus on working in the area of family and sexual violence elimination. So I was able to do that. So that's one of the great things about, I think, working in a large organisation. If you put your hand up for something that a lot of people find uncomfortable, you'll get the opportunities. And at that time, it was still pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people to think about family violence. Yeah.
So could you talk to me a bit more about your career then from there, from where we got to?
Right. So I worked at Work and Income, then I moved across to ACC, and I was a mediator and negotiator with ACC. So it was sort of aligned. I was there for a year as a mediator and negotiator, setting up a team. Great work. But then Helen Clark came in, the Clark government came in and got rid of the legislation that had sort of privatised work accidents, which is the area I was working in, which I was actually stoked about, to be fair. Basically because, mediating, negotiating people's lives as to whether they would have cover or not was pretty extraordinary. There was that. And then I went into case management, and I was really fortunate, or not, I'm not sure. I had new work accidents, but then we kind of did this mixed model where, as a case manager, I had a number of elderly people who needed home help, right through to complex, serious injuries, which are people who would, you're just offering and supporting rehab to give them quality of life. They would never heal. So tetraplegics, people with severe injuries. And my caseloads happened to have a whole pile of, well, when I say a whole pile, 6 children who had been beaten as children and were subsequently brain damaged to the point where they were, unable to function without support on a daily. So again, it was being able to support and engage with those families, and I didn't do that work for very long. But when it struck me absolutely that we would allocate funds for these children who had been, for the rest of their lives, lots of resource to support them. But there was no money going into prevention from ACC in the family violence space. Nothing. And that struck me as the most bizarre thing. So when I left that job and I went to the Ministry of Justice, I was fortunate enough to start a project and dragged ACC into that project, which resulted in them starting to fund prevention. They realised actually going to end up preventing so much, put it blandly, cost to the state by preventing family violence. It was just sorry about that. Just constantly moving the dial and constantly drawing attention back to that. So that role in the Ministry of Justice, I did it for 11 years. I loved it. I just loved it. So as a domestic violence advisor, ran a region of providers of services, but had this really cool opportunity to work collaboratively across government to break down the silos around family violence. And part of it was, getting ACC on board. So that started to have some more money to fund the family violence prevention space. And, we just did some amazing work in that space. I just loved it. And it was, like a magpie. It was a new shiny thing, but it was also, I could see strategically the long-term impact of this work. And eventually, a few years after that, fair few years, we now have a joint venture on family violence, which is sort of the outcome of this work many, many years ago in the 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of our sponsors. I'm really pleased to announce that we have Sharp New Zealand as a sponsor. And it's great to have Sharp on board because as a customer, I can speak about their products and services from personal experience. And it feels good to be able to endorse and recommend a company because of the level of satisfaction we have regarding the services they provide. And across my businesses, we've certainly been impressed with the care and collaboration we've experienced in our dealings with Sharp. It's certainly a brand that we trust. Sharp has a long history of creating breakthrough products designed to meet the needs of people living in New Zealand. Sharp's leadership in technology innovation ensures it's at the forefront of the pack, providing business solutions from printing and photocopying to interactive meeting solutions and ICT phone systems. No matter where you are or what size your organisation, whether you're large or small, Sharp New Zealand can provide their services to you nationwide. If you're looking to upgrade your technology or renew your photocopier leases, talk to your local Sharp team or visit the website at sharp.net.nz. So I haven't really framed this question yet, so forgive me if it comes out the wrong way, but I was just thinking about this. You mentioned a couple of times within that passage there about how fortunate you were to have the opportunity. Do you think that that's kind of you putting stuff out there and like the universe sending it your way, or you subconsciously seeing and finding and creating these opportunities because that's what you're passionate about?
Bit of both. Yeah. Sometimes timing is an amazing thing, right? You just end up somewhere along the way in a place you never thought you'd be. But also I've never been shy about coming forward and speaking up. And I've also, this family violence is an area that everyone agrees it's a bad thing. So most people are like, oh, it's hard to do something, but let's do something. Even if they get it wrong, they'd rather do something than not. So I guess part of it is around seeking the opportunities and pretty driven. I've been pretty driven in this space for a long time. But the other part is also just, I've had some amazing mentors and people who have been prepared to let me kind of run with ideas as well and just, basically put in the hard work to get the results, really.
So when was the Women's Refuge? Was that kind of after the Justice Department? Yep.
Yeah. So I had it was 11 years and the job had shifted tremendously and there were lots of opportunities, but it had kind of got to the point where I'd been there a long time and the things that I wanted to be able to do, I wasn't able to do. I was working for, Ministry of Justice. You would understand, having been in the police force, you couldn't speak out against policies you didn't agree with or things that you didn't think were going well. And it just kind of got to the point where I thought, no, my time here is done. And so I started looking around, and Tauranga Women's Refuge had been one of the organisations who I'd worked with for those 11 years. I knew it was a really sound organisation, and I had a good working relationship with them. And the job just appeared. And I thought, oh, I'll give that a crack. So I applied and I was fortunate enough to get the job. And, I had all of that experience and background, but I'd never worked in an NGO except as a volunteer. So, so being a manager of a service, it was like my dream job, but also terrifying. Yeah.
And so how did, on a personal level, that's, I suppose, shifting a little bit away from, a higher level kind of trying to make things happen within the community in the roles that you've had to actually physically being hands-on, directly helping or directly witnessing as well. What was the growth for you in that?
So part of it was around, I had these really deep and enriching conversations for like 11 years with different service providers about the actual change they were making. And really, in the Ministry of Justice, I was facilitating that process, but I wasn't able to, get the personal reward of it was a step removed from the personal reward of working directly with women and children. And I also thought, I don't have any credibility to tell these organisations how to do their work if I haven't done it myself as well. So I should get a good grounding in NGO work to understand fully what is happening on the ground, because I can't advocate best for these organisations, or I can't without fully kind of experiencing it, walking in their shoes. So that's what I did. Gave it a crack. Got to say, I was tremendous. I was going to say it again, tremendously lucky. No, I was very, very fortunate to have my dear friend Hazel Hape, who was the previous manager, stay on as a trustee, governance. She supported me, like, not only on a personal level, but and emotionally, but also as an employee. And when I left, she went back and managed the Refuge. And once you're in, you're never out, I think, with Refuge. And just so pleased to have the support of good women around me to do that work, because it's very hard, real hard work.
So from a kind of rewarding perspective, what were your, I was going to say achievements, but it's probably not the right word, but I mean, I know that you did achieve some things.
Yeah,
I've read
sure.
about this, but what were the wins for you? What difference did you make in that role?
Lots of different things in different spaces. But I guess for me, it was also about having the freedom to actually speak the truth of because I'd come from working in government organisations where literally you're unable to kind of criticise, publicly you can't do those kinds of things. And so I had this freedom to be able to say what sucked, actually what was wrong with, and because there was a credible story to tell around the Refuge and the movement of the Women's Refuge movement, it was incredibly freeing to be able to literally say to people, we've had 9 years without any funding increases. Our workload has increased fourfold. The government funds us $21.25 an hour, and I have 14 staff to pay out of $21.25 an hour. On what level is this okay? And it just wasn't. There was no justification and no ability for to be clapped back at. It was literally, we're expecting you to fundraise to do the work that we contract you for. And it was a great place to be. So lots and lots of opportunities, talk to media, talk to government agencies, and they all couldn't disagree. They were all, yeah, you're right. Lots of opportunities to fundraise to our community and say, literally, this is what it means for us. We finish our contracts in the first 3 months of the year from government, and the rest is fundraised by this community. Now, if you care about victims of family violence, please help. And they did. Amazing opportunities. It was So there was that side of it, the politicising side of it, the work that happens on the smell of an oily rag that, as far as I was concerned, was not good enough to actually, you literally cannot expect an issue that costs billions of dollars in the country to be managed and taken care of without funding it by expecting volunteers to work 24/7 to do this work. You know, it's like, do you want this to stop, or do you just want it to quietly go away? Do you literally want it to stop or not? So that was a huge freeing experience. The other thing was, you know, and I haven't really said it, but I had over the years done voluntary work as a non-Māori woman's facilitator in programs, family violence programs, and I'd worked, you know, a lot of the time with different people in the different roles that I had. And so for me, it was tremendously rewarding to have that moment where you see the light go on for a woman or her children, that they weren't to blame, that they weren't at fault. And once you see that light go on, they can never go back to a state of confusion. They can always hold that and then begin to journey. And so, yeah, just the most rewarding work.
Do you feel that your life experience of having domestic violence within your family as a child, that's benefited you? It sounds wrong.
No,
but has it benefited you in the roles that you've had, particularly that role there?
Absolutely.
Because you've been able to be more genuine and authentic.
Yep.
As opposed to someone who's never experienced that firsthand, doesn't know about it, coming in and doing a theoretical kind of job.
I have walked in the shoes of victims of family violence, and, you know, that does help. Mind you, 1 in 3 women have, so it's not like I'm a rare creature. But I think, you know, I was quite determined around this space. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think of myself as a victim. I think it was an experience that I had, or experiences that I had as a young person. I'm not that victim now. I'm not in that situation now. And so I can just, you know, use that as a learning opportunity to help others. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know, like I said, I think I read about some of the fundraising that you've done and working with supermarkets and the likes to, you know, create or overcome the funding issue around food provision and things like that, which is a great outcome. What's changed since you were there in respect of funding? Has that changed, or is that still now an issue that actually these organisations need to fundraise within the community? Is it better?
It's much better. They still need to fundraise, but billions of additional money has gone across the whole sector now. You know, I remember my first year and in Parliament, and we put $76 million straight into frontline services. So that was the beginning, and then every year subsequently we've put more money into frontline services, recognising that actually making people work for free or minimum wage just isn't going to systematically change anything. So, yeah, I felt a huge part of the voice into that over my 5 years in Parliament, just being able to speak to that. And it's been, you know, I'm just so thankful we now have a minister for the elimination of family and sexual violence, or the prevention of. That we also have just this joint venture now, which sort of sits across 10 government agencies, and those 10 government agencies, their CEs are linked in and have to respond, and they each have work programs, and we now have this you know, it's up to 30 years worth of progress plan working forward about the elimination of this stuff, which is, you know, I felt a small part of that. It's everyone knows I'm that refuge woman. But it has been really good. I haven't been up in the forefront of that work, but I have been quietly, systematically working the room, shall we say, in those spaces. And, many of my friends still continue to work in the sector at the forefront. So it's really good to be able to work between government and the NGO sector and to be talking.
So that answer was great. Segue into the next kind of, I would call it chapter. I always talk about people, living a life that's a story worth retelling. So if you think about it in chapters, your kind of political career, like you said, it was started about 5 years ago, 2017.
Yep.
So before we get into more detail about that, which I'd love to do, what drove that? What changed that? I mean, you've talked about, I think you labelled yourself as a political activist.
Yeah.
And clearly you were probably doing a good job on the outside of politics in that respect. But then you chose to get into politics. What drove that from being at the Refuge to taking that leap?
I guess it was a few things, but one of them was the cumulative effect of having to beg for money in the community, and something I saw that was, fundamentally it should have been funded by government agencies who were contracting us to do this work, and then when the money ran out, they would still contract us to do the work. So we would, over deliver, and there was no money for it. So there was that, and that really annoyed me. Like, that frustrated the hell out of me, because literally, how could we be expected to do the work of all of these government agencies? Because they'd close their case files, DHB would close their work, and Oranga Tamariki, or SIFs as it was at the time, they'd close their files when we picked up their clients. We had no money to do that. So that was one of the things that really frustrated me about it. It was basically, how can this be? Because we have a good heart and we know it's important work. You take advantage of us doing that. We are taken advantage of because we'll never go on strike and we'll never stop doing this work. I mean, it was a really bad bargaining point, right? So there's that. But I guess for me, the moment, I do have these clarifying moments where something just sort of, it's almost like something stops in my brain. It's a moment where, because as the manager, I had my staff, and they were working and engaged and having really good, close relationships with the women and children that came into the whārewa in the community. And so a lot of their social work depended on good relationships with them and helping and supporting them. And so I often got to be the bearer of bad news. And the bearer of bad news was something that I didn't like to do but had to. So what happens in the Women's Refuge and the Safe House is that we could only have up to 10 people. So that was up to, 4 adult women and a mixture of children. If there was a mama and she came in and she had 6 kids, then there's only 3 other spaces available, So it was a constant communal living space that was always very carefully maintained. When you came into the Safe House, you needed to come into the Safe House under a certain set of criteria. Because remember, this is a city of 126,000 people, as it was at the time. We had space for 10 women and children in total. So we had to maintain a really strict criteria for them coming and staying. And it was basically around being unsafe in the community. They needed to be in hiding. And we would often get women and children who come from other communities to be in hiding with us. And we would send our women out as well. And so when they were once, we would work with these women, you basically, their lives would be enriched. They would feel good about themselves. They would start to go out into the community and explore, and they would start to, understand that they didn't need to live with violence and that their partners, change or not, they were going to be okay. And so when they were safe in the community, they had to leave the safe house. We would try work with them to get them somewhere to live. But literally, they couldn't stay at the safe house. And so it resulted in me having to evict women and children. And that's hard enough. But when you have a housing crisis, which is what we had, but it wasn't, the national government refused to accept it as a crisis. We couldn't get our women and children into anything. They often had really bad credit ratings. They often, their houses had been wrecked and all sorts of things. We couldn't get them anywhere. And some communities, some places refused to have refuge women, because they were afraid of what was going to happen. So basically, I ended up having to evict women and children into homelessness. And I remember this day, and it was just awful. This mama, she'd been there. She was now safe in the community. She started going out, and her kids were safe. We couldn't get her anywhere, and we had other families that needed to come into the safe house, and I had to evict her, and I had to evict her into complete and utter homelessness, so that she would get far enough up the list with work and income to be able to go into a motel for a week. And that was all we could give her. And I just felt morally corrupt. Because she said to me, well, what was the point of leaving? And that's when women often go back, because at least they had a home for their kids, right? And I just thought, there's something. I just cannot continue to play this game. I cannot. I had to do that. I had to put that family out on the street. And it just broke my heart. And I thought, right, that's it. I'm going into politics. I'm changing the world. So that's basically what I did. I'd had people ask me if I'd want to, you should go into politics, that kind of thing. I thought, stuff it. I'll do it.
And you did.
And I did. I did.
Yeah.
Again, timing, amazing thing.
Yeah. Can I ask you? I dabbled with the idea myself of going into politics some time ago, for the reasons that were driving me at the time. And that didn't pan out. In hindsight, I'm probably pleased it didn't. I don't know that I could handle being a politician, to be honest with you, and be subjected to the kind of scrutiny that you get and the constant kind of limelight of whatever you do is wrong by somebody. So what's it like being a politician?
Well, it's this incredible mix of just amazing privilege and opportunity with unrelenting work and drudgery.
Right.
Yeah. Like, I often tell people it's really funny. You'll be in the supermarket and you'll be, in the sanitary product aisle or something, and someone will be holding you the product, and someone will be up talking to you about their local issue. So you don't get, at times, it can be incredibly intrusive into, sometimes you just need some peace and quiet and calm. But at the same time, man, I've had the most amazing opportunities to do things and to change things and to have experiences, international experiences. It can be lonely and it can be hard, but I've got some amazing friends who are in Parliament who understand. I've got some amazing friends who long-time friends since, children. And you just learn to cherish those that you can trust. Yeah. But, yeah, it's the most bizarre experience when you go into Parliament and you realise that all the security guards have learnt your name and people literally stop and open doors for you, like literally open doors for you. And when you're off and out and about and doing something, people treat you differently. And then I always find people are like, you're just quite normal, aren't you? Yes, I am. I'm quite normal. I put my trousers on one leg at a time, and I think that's the joy or the blessing of having list MPs as well as electorate MPs. There's a series of people that get into Parliament who wouldn't normally be in Parliament. So yeah, we get that chance.
So any like I was saying, any regrets is probably not the right way to pitch that, really. But was it worth it to step into politics? Yes, it was. It was. Yeah, you can see. I could see that look on your face there. You're about to. It was a real surprise when I first started. Like it really was. That you think, okay, you're an MP, great. You go into Parliament, you realise you've lost the ability to control your day. And having been in an NGO, and I was used to being able to problem solve and fix things and fast paced, but I was also able to control my day. When you're in Parliament and you're backbencher, you're literally not able to leave the precinct unless you have a whip slip, unless it's lunchtime or dinner time, right? And so, people say to me, oh, wow, where's a great place to eat in Wellington? I have no idea. There are 2 places I eat in Wellington. One of them is my apartment and the other is Copperfields, which is our local, our cafe that's sitting in the, you don't get out, you don't get to shop, you don't get to explore, you don't get to do any of those things. You're literally there, and you're there from about 8 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. So your days are long, and you can't just whip out for a coffee with a friend or something. You're literally there the whole time. So it's a long day, and I didn't realise that that's how it worked with being on precinct. But yeah, I'm used to it now, but it felt very confining. Yeah. Yeah. Talking about that, confining, that's probably a good word there. You mentioned another word as well. I'm just trying to think of it. Or you said that your days are kind of controlled.
Yeah.
And I'm asking a current politician in the current government this question. So I'm kind of expecting a political answer or a PC answer.
Yeah.
But, how constraining is it for a political activist to be an MP in government?
Yep.
And I'm thinking here about you, kind of driving your agenda, your life's work, which we've talked about at length today. But being an MP is, it's much broader range than just that.
Yeah.
How is that for you?
Look, I think I'm tremendously lucky with the party I'm in. And I know you're going to go, oh, yeah, of course, that's a thing you would say. But literally, I don't have, that we have what's called a caucus, right? And what goes on in caucus is pretty sacrosanct. You don't talk about it. But generally speaking, if I have something to say, I will say it. I will be heard. I can change things. Things have been changed because of what I've said and done. And that literally, I don't know if that is in other parties. I imagine it might be. I'm not sure. But the ability to caucus and have the discussion and to hash it out, and it can be very intense, but literally we're all equals in that room. Now, people may believe that that's not true, but I don't give a fig if they think that that's not the case, because I certainly feel like an equal in that room. And there's no point in my career where I've actually had to sit on my hands or shut my mouth. I can have my say. It might not change anything, but I can certainly have my say. And I think that's the value of good policy making as well. When you have a group of people like we've got quite a few, varied list MPs and electorate MPs now with different walks of life and experience. We all come at things differently. An example for me would be I went to my caucus with an idea about food rescue, and I think, you mentioned that before. And when I was at Refuge, I worked really closely with Good Neighbour Food Rescue, my local food rescue organisation, who transformed the funding that we needed to get. I didn't have to fundraise for meat and food for families. We had this food supplied to us from Food Rescue, and I basically went to Parliament with the idea that, because I think, they basically supported us to the tune of about $70,000 a year worth of food and cleaning products and toilet paper and sanitary products and all of that sort of stuff. So I went to Parliament with the idea that we should do something about that. And I remember the first time I wanted to engage with it, and I took a paper to caucus and I engaged caucus on it, and everyone was like, "Oh yeah, sounds like an all right idea," or whatever. But it took a period of time, and the idea itself was picked up in budget. We got $32 million for it, and it was to set up the system across the country at a time when COVID had just hit, where we needed to get food out to families, where we needed a support, we needed a mechanism. And so it was kind of like that fresh thinking that just at the time was needed, and that became part of a significant piece of work that continues today now with that food sector, because it's the story, right? It's the story of environmental benefits, but it's also poverty and food poverty, and it's also just about the fact that nobody likes waste, food waste. How ridiculous! Hungry people, and we're throwing away all this food. So that was an example of how, as a member, I can, you can influence regardless of where you sit in caucus, whether you're a minister or a backbencher. Yeah. So yeah.
So it's good. That's good. I was going to ask you about that. So I mean, I've heard it said a lot actually, and it was said to me when I was thinking about this a long time ago. That, getting into politics, you get into politics because you think you're going to change the world, right? Yeah. Which is what you said. And yet it's not like that. And the bureaucracy and towing the party line and everything's controlled and constrained. And, so you've obviously just shared with us there an example of a success that you've had in that respect. If you think about your ability in previous roles, in particular the previous role where you were hands-on with the Refuge, the difference that you made and that you felt you could make versus the difference you can make in politics and what you're feeling that you're making. How does that compare and contrast? Is it, because I think, well, I'm not wanting to answer the question for you, but I'm just giving you the context of the question. Personally, I would have felt at the time that if I get into politics, I'll be able to scale it up. I'll be able to make more of a difference and achieve more in a shorter time frame by being where the policy is made.
Yeah.
Is that the case, or is it frustrating?
Yeah, it actually is the case. Obviously, it's still slower than, when you're in an NGO and you want to fix something, you just write an article and you yell it out to people when things shift. Yeah, and it's more systematic. And so it's a long game. You play the long game. So for me, it's kind of incrementally, I have seen such a huge shift in the way that family violence is focused on. in the last 5 years than how it ever has been. And it's always been a problem, and a wicked problem to solve. But yeah, genuinely, would I like it to be faster? Would I like it to be solved? Of course, I'd like it to be solved. I'd like it done. Thanks. I'd like this immense harm that happens to a third of our population to go. And we haven't even brushed on sexual violence and the harm that does, right? But literally, I ended up where I needed to be at the time that I needed to be there. I don't know if that sounds a little bit woo-woo, but I got the opportunity to influence at a time where there was a team of people prepared to listen to my experience, but also to build on that. And I'm not the only one in my team as well. So my good friend, the Honourable Priyanka Radhakrishnan, she worked at Shakti Ethnic Women's Refuge as well. And so her and I have had lots of experience in this space. And there were other members like Portal Williams and Carmel Cepoloni, who all had worked in this sector. So it was a really tight network. I think I would have probably felt a little disheartened if we hadn't kept having these changes occurring every budget, money attached, new policy attached, new directions, new corrections, the moving forward of this work. We're in a good place. Lots to do, but a good place. I'm not sure if I answered that question. I think I started wandering off there.
No, I think you did. I think it's also, again, you're very good at giving me a nice segue into the next piece. Lots to do. And you mentioned the long game.
Yeah.
So are you in politics for the long game?
Oh, it's a tough one, that. I'm in it for more than this year, put it that way. I find it quite, at times, quite aggressive and violent. Is like one of the things that has happened over the last probably couple of years is there has been a real change in how I feel about my personal safety. And a lot of MPs talk about this. So I can be driving on our motorway, or I can be driving on Hewlett's Road, and people will wind down their window and yell and scream abuse at me. I could be at the supermarket and people will just come up to me and bail me up and be really aggressive. I've had people drive towards me in their cars, those kinds of things. That takes a toll. And so it's that balance, right? It's like, I know that this will sound very trite, but I don't do this to get a benefit out of it. Like I'm genuinely want to serve my community. But at some point, if it gets worse, I will make the choice to walk away. And I'll go do something completely different. Mm. But literally it's, people think they have the right to have a go at you, and that is not the case. I'll call out abuse where I see it. People don't get a chance to speak to me like that. They want to have a decent and reasonable conversation. Sweet, let's do that. And I can understand that people might be passionate, but abusive, screaming out the window that I'm driving towards me in their vehicles, those kinds of things. That's crap.
It's not acceptable, is it? I think this is one of the reasons why I'm keen to have people like yourself on the show, is to, irrespective of your political persuasion, to realise that actually there are people who are in roles, who are in those roles because they're passionate about a subject, about making a difference.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with their perspective, agree with which party it is or whatever, they're people. Absolutely. Trying to do a good job based on what they know and their mindset and their view of the world. And now you can disagree with the perspective, you can disagree with policy, but they're still people, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think it's a valid point that you've raised. And I suppose from you know, hearing about what happens overseas in the UK where MPs have lost their lives.
Yeah.
It's something that we in New Zealand, we never think would happen here.
Yeah.
But clearly you're experiencing a bit of an escalation in that kind of thing. So we need to take notice of that.
Well, and one of the things is I'm quite protected from it. Like when I'm by myself, it's different. But, you know, we have a lot of systems to keep us safe. But, you know, our staff work in an environment that's incredibly abusive to them. And, you know, I make no mistake, I'm not okay with that happening. I was in a workplace where someone was murdered in their workplace at ACC at the time. Right. And so I know how things can turn very bad very quickly. But I guess the other part of it is my family as well. So my family never signed up for this. They never signed up to be sitting with me somewhere and have someone bail me up and abuse me. They never signed up for the constant sense of having to kind of monitor my safety and watch. And I'm a relatively low-key MP. Like, a lot of people don't know I'm an MP, and I'm quite happy about that. But, you know, it really upsets my husband. It really does. He's like, I don't want you to do this anymore. Mind you, he did that as well when I was at Refuge, and, you know, I'd go out at night and pick up women and stuff. He'd be like, be safe, I'm coming with you, you know, and I'd be like, you can't come with me. They don't want to see you. They want to see a woman. They don't want to see a man, you know. But, yeah, that really, it is hard. It's a huge toll. And then, fortunately, my kids are older, like they're adults. So that's the other thing, right? If I had smaller kids and that kind of abuse was happening, I'd be very concerned. I wouldn't want to put my children in that circumstance or situation.
So what do you think I mean, it's just maybe a silly question, but what do you think the answer is, Angie? I mean, because we don't want good people leaving politics through fear. Yeah. That's not the kind of, surely it's not the kind of society that we want. We want, again, irrespective of which party we want people representing different views, right? That's Otherwise, we haven't got a democracy anymore.
Absolutely.
And so how do we go about making people like yourself feel safer and actually are safer, not just feel safer, but actually are safer?
Well, like I say, we've got some really good systems in place, and I won't go into them because they are really some really good systems in place to help support our safety personally and on precinct as well as in our offices, etc. But I think, I mean, the reality is this: when you're in an environment where it is, you know, people are braver on they're braver as keyboard warriors than they are any other time. But then there's a percentage of people who are just literally, they don't care. They do not care where you sit. You're a baddie because you're a politician. Doesn't matter what your views are. You're a baddie because you're a politician. Those concerns are that, if you were a mum of young kids, you wouldn't, or a dad of young kids, you wouldn't want to do this work. And I guess what it is for New Zealand to grow up a little bit, because we've had it pretty lucky for a long time. You know, I can be in the supermarket on my own shopping, getting me toilet paper, you know. But we just now have to have a different sense of safety because people think it's okay. And again, it comes back to beliefs and values and myths and disinformation, you know. People believe what they want to believe, and it's
a shame, isn't it?
System.
I think it's one of the beautiful things about New Zealand is the ability to reach out and be able to talk to people like yourself. You know, I again, hack back to when I was thinking about it, I wanted to know what it was like to be a politician. So I reached out to a lot of politicians and spoke to a lot of politicians.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done that in the UK.
Yeah.
I never saw a politician in the UK the whole time I was there, but over here, you can bump into them in the supermarket.
Well, you know, and long may it last, right?
Yeah.
Long may it last. I mean, we just have to be a bit more careful now. Like I say, it was pretty bad during the lockdown period and stuff. You know, it was pretty bad around that sort of mandate period. But most of the time, it's pretty much okay. And like I say, even door knocking, you know, which is one of the things we do as politicians, even door knocking, usually the rudest you'll get is someone say, don't want to talk to you, and firmly shut the door in your face. Most people are pretty good. But yeah, there is that element, and I think we just need to be a bit more modern in our thinking around that stuff. Yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time.
Oh.
And we're taking time out of your day, which I appreciate. I really do. But I did want to talk to you. Where I thought that question was going to go about longevity in politics was, you know, towards what your legacy might be. So this podcast is about life, work, and legacy. Whether you're in politics or let's assume that things come right and you are in politics a lot longer.
Definitely intending to stay.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So let's make that assumption. And so in politics and relative to the things that you're passionate about, what do you want to achieve in the future, and what do you think that you'd like your legacy to be? And that's not to say that you've not already created one. It's just to say that, you know, obviously you're a young politician, and there's
I like that. Yeah, I'm in my 50s. I like
remember that fiver that you said you'd give me. You know, so there's a long way to go yet for you in your career. What would you like to achieve? And you know, if you imagine, zoom forward to a ripe old age, you're sitting on the porch. Yeah. You're talking to grandkids or whoever about your life that's a story worth retelling. What do you want your legacy to be at that point in time?
Oh, crikey. It's such a big question, isn't it? So
it's huge. Should have started with that, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I guess part of it is, so there are so many other facets to my life that we've not talked about here. So absolutely, one of the things is I want people to be able to say that woman, Angie Warren-Clark, she was instrumental in helping us change the tide of violence that happened in this country. The pieces of work that she did and the things that she did with her government, her friends, her whatever, her employer, whatever, been worthwhile. They've had purpose and meaning, and it doesn't matter if it's a huge leap or a small leap, she made things better. So that's in that space. In the environmental and fishing space, which is another huge area of my life, you know, I want to have that same sense of, you know, there were things that I spoke about and fed into that actually enabled our oceans to be cleaner and healthier, and for our fishing to be a better, you know, for our fish stocks to grow, for our environment to thrive. There are those things. And then I guess I want my legacy to also be about, I was a damn good parent, and I was a kind friend, and it wasn't just all about the things that I did outwardly, but actually I was a thoroughly decent person that no matter what, I made a difference to people who I cared and loved about. It literally, you know, I think about my daughter and raising her without violence, and the fact that she is so not an activist. She doesn't need to be. She doesn't need to fight in the way that I did for the space around this, you know. So some of that stuff, really, really basic, like being a decent person, that's my legacy. I want people to go, you know what, didn't agree with her politics. Damn, she was nice. She actually heard me and listened to me, and we engaged, and that was a good thing.
Great. Well, look, I can tell everyone that this is the first time I've met you, and I think you're a very nice person.
Oh, very good.
Very easy to have a conversation with. And so I think really on that point, I'd like to thank you again for being here today, taking time out of your busy schedule. You've talked about how long your days are. So I really do appreciate you coming along and taking the time to talk to me, but also for sharing and being so open and transparent about your past and your passion and the work that you do, and the lessons that you've learned along the way, and sharing that with me. It's made me think about some things that have, that I've experienced in my past, and I'll continue to think about those. So I'm grateful for that. So thank you.
Look, thank you for having this conversation with me. I've really enjoyed it. I'm hoping I don't have any remorse about what I've said or that my double chin got too big in there. But look, it's been wonderful. Thank you. I would recommend 5 stars.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Thank you. As you will hopefully know by now, if you've seen other episodes, this segment of the podcast is all about wisdom worth sharing. At the end of every interview, I'll look back as part of the editing process and discover some of the gems that came out during the conversation and summarise them here. The title of this episode is The Long Game. Angie said that she was in politics for the long game, but she also was very clear that she's been in the long game of change when it comes to reducing or eradicating family violence. She has worked since being a teenager in this area, and in fact made up her mind as a 7-year-old that she would stand up and fight against violence in the home. This was one life's work interview where the interviewee could literally talk about their life's work, because that is what it was. Often we find ourselves going down a certain path later in life because of both conscious and unconscious connections and decisions that have influenced us along the way. For Angie, her whole life so far has been dedicated to making a difference in this area, and there's not many people who can say that about their choices, their decisions and their actions. Angie's speak for themselves. She has and continues to do real good work and make a difference in this area. I enjoyed this interview so much, and clearly it was down to the interviewee. Angie is one of the nicest people you could ever wish to meet. She is absolutely passionate, enthusiastic and committed in a big way to the causes that are important to her. And there are several, including reducing family violence, the environment, and being a good parent for her children. It wasn't intentional, but the entire interview was on the subject of family violence, or domestic violence as it used to be called. Despite being so passionate due to her own experiences of family violence, both firsthand as a result of being beaten as a child, as well as in her work career being exposed to so many cases, she remains down-to-earth, articulate, and reasoned in her pursuit for settling for nothing less than significant change in New Zealand society. Something that can't be said for others trying to bring about change that they want to see, including other politicians. We need more Angies in the world. People who can talk, be passionate, forthright and to the point, but do so in a way that's conducive to not switching other people off. Angie talked about the choices men make. It's mainly men who commit family violence. There's no getting away from that. We need to own it. And when I say we, all men need to play a role. Those who commit violent acts are in the minority, thankfully. But if the majority remains silent and don't get involved, we're missing a great opportunity to positively influence those in our communities that still think that this is okay. What Angie said was that when we inflict violence, we are making a choice, and we simply need to choose differently. I questioned this during the interview because to me it didn't seem that simple. When we know that we are creatures of our environment and we become like those that we hang around with, therefore we can grow up with violence and it become a part of our DNA, epigenetics they call it. It could be ingrained, so much so that there's no gap between stimulus and response. Something happens or something is said, and then bam, they lash out. A bit like when Angie's father saw her pulling a Remembrance Day poppy apart. It's because of this I questioned whether it was a choice or whether it was a reaction, learned behaviour that's now become automatic. That's how our brains work. As a way of saving energy, it learns something and then creates a neural pathway so we don't have to think about it. A bit like lifting a drink to our mouth. We don't think about it, we just do it. However, I was getting hung up on the mechanics of the brain function and not focused on the bigger picture at play. What Angie made me realize was that if we inflict violence, we witness the hurt and the damage we cause, and then don't do anything to change our neural pathway. That's the choice we're making right there. Choosing not to learn how to change the pathway. Angie's dad had inflicted violence on her as a child, and she talked openly about that. She was hopeful that her father didn't mind her talking about this, and I'm hopeful too, because without being willing to share stories like that, nothing will ever change. Angie's father should be proud, and I'm sure he is, of Angie's work and her achievements, but also he should be proud of himself. He made the choice to change and did so. That takes guts, to be open to criticism, admitting that you're wrong, and having fear about change, as we all do. He had to be vulnerable in order to make that change, and that takes effort. And it takes the support of people around you, and often of people that you may never have met yet. The key is, find the help and support you need. It's available. But you have to want to change badly enough to take the steps in the right direction. There's support out there for men who feel that they could harm loved ones. And if they want to contact anyone, hey Wakatapu on 0800 439 276. Or if you're a victim of family violence and you need help, you can call Shine on 0508 744 633. There are many organisations that can help. These are just two. But the main thing is you have to want to change and do something about it. Whichever the side of the issue that you're on, you're not alone. Get the help you need. The last point I want to make about Angie's interview is actually twofold. The first is, if we're not careful, we're at risk of becoming like other countries where violent actions towards politicians occurs frequently. Angie told us of how she's seen an increase in verbal abuse and even had vehicles driven at her. Now, we can't behave like this. We can't claim that we want freedom of speech and then take actions that lead to a reduction of democracy. If our politicians don't feel safe, they'll stand down and leave. There's not many of us that would want that job. We should be grateful for those that do. Yes, we should be able to express ourselves, but we need to make it about policy, not people. And I think that's all the more reason politics in our country needs to be less about personalities and more about policy and the changes that we want and need to see for our society. It's a nice segue into my second point. I believe that politicians could and should be leading the way when it comes to acts of civility. The term opposition subconsciously leads to opposing parties pushing back on anything and everything. We need a parliament where politicians, no matter what side of the fence they sit, are more willing to work together on key issues that we all need to see change. Family violence is one of those, of course. Wouldn't it be nice if they were able to agree more, work together more, and actually bring about significant change? I saw a post online from Angie. She'd wished Todd Muller all the best for the future after his decision to stand down at the next election. She said they had a good working relationship. And irrespective of our political persuasion, I think we all need to see more of that. Hopefully, you've been able to take many insights away from the interview that you can apply to some aspects of your own life, work, and legacy. Use it, share it with others. As I always say, sharing is like teaching. Teaching helps us retain what we've learned and commit to change, which is necessary if we are to enhance our own life's work. I hope that you're happy, safe, and successful in all that you do. And remember, live a life that's a story worth retelling. I'm Steve Worsley, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Life's Work, the podcast all about wisdom worth sharing.